The modern Olympic marathon is a beautiful spectacle of peak human performance. It's a showcase of elite athletes, men and women who have dedicated their entire lives to their craft, supported by teams of scientists, doctors and nutritionists, all working together to push the absolute limits of human endurance. We watch in awe as they glide over the pavement, their bodies perfectly tuned machines. But it wasn't always this way. In the sweltering, sticky summer heat of 1904 in St. Louis, Missouri, the third Olympic marathon of the modern era was something else entirely. It wasn't a race. It was a bizarre, tragic, and often comical parade of human suffering, orchestrated by officials whose scientific understanding was dangerously wrong. It was a race with only one water stop, where the man who finished first was a cheat who had ridden in a car for half the course. It was a race where the man who was ultimately declared the winner was actively poisoned by his own trainers and was hallucinating as he shuffled across the finish line. It was a race where competitors were chased off course by wild dogs, where one man almost died from inhaling dust, and where another took a nap after eating rotten apples he stole from an orchard. This is the story of the 1904 Olympic Marathon, and it was, without a single doubt, the single most insane and disastrous race ever held. The stage for disaster. To understand how this athletic event could go so horribly, catastrophically wrong, you first have to understand the context of the 1904 St. Louis Olympics themselves. From the very beginning, these games were a fiasco. They were originally awarded to the city of Chicago, but St. Louis, which was already hosting the massive Louisiana Purchase Exposition, better known as the 1904 World's Fair, essentially hijacked the games. The fair's organizers, powerful men with immense political clout, argued that holding a competing international event in Chicago would diminish the prestige of their fair. They threatened to hold their own, bigger athletic competition, and the fledgling International Olympic Committee, fearing it would be overshadowed, reluctantly moved the games to St. Louis. This decision had two immediate and disastrous consequences. First, it meant the Olympics were not the main event. They were treated as a mere sideshow, an afterthought to the months-long spectacle of the World's Fair. Second, it ensured that the Games would have very little international participation. In 1904, transatlantic travel was slow and expensive, and the journey to the remote Midwestern city of St. Louis was particularly arduous. As a result, the vast majority of European nations and athletes simply didn't come. Of the 651 athletes who competed in St. Louis, over 580 of them were from the United States. In more than half of the events, the United States was the only nation competing. The 1904 Olympics were less of a global competition and more of a glorified American track and field meet, with a few token international guests. The overall atmosphere of the Games was a strange and often grotesque mix of genuine athletic competition and P.T. Barnum-esque sideshow antics. The most infamous example of this was the so-called Anthropology Days. The fair's organizers, including the head of the Games, James Sullivan, had gathered indigenous peoples from all over the world, Pygmies from Africa, Igorot from the Philippines, Patagonians from South America, to be put on display in human zoos as part of the fair's exhibits. For 2 days, these men were forced to compete in Olympic events like the high jump, shot put, and the marathon. The entire event was a grotesque and deeply racist pseudo-scientific experiment designed to prove the athletic and cultural superiority of the white American athletes. This was the bizarre and misguided mindset of the men who were about to organize a marathon, and it was this belief in their own superior scientific understanding that led to the single most dangerous decision of the entire event. James Sullivan and his chief of staff, Charles Lucas, were fascinated by the emerging field of sports science, but their knowledge was based on crackpot theories. One of the prevailing ideas at the time was that drinking water during strenuous exercise was actively harmful. It was believed to cause cramps, side stitches, and was generally seen as a sign of weakness and poor conditioning. Sullivan and Lucas decided to use the Olympic marathon as a live experiment to study the effects of purposeful dehydration. Based on this horrifyingly wrong-headed idea, they made a decision that would turn a challenging race into a life-threatening ordeal. For the entire duration of the 24.85-mile or 40-kilometer course, There would be only one official water source for the runners, a well located at approximately the 12-mile mark. There would be no other water provided. They wanted to see how the runners would fare under these conditions, believing it was a true test of their mettle. They were about to find out. A rogues gallery of competitors. The cast of characters who lined up for the start of the marathon on that brutally hot afternoon was a perfect reflection of the strange, semi-professional nature of the games. There were serious, well-trained athletes, but they were joined by amateurs, adventurers, and men who had no business running a marathon at all. The favorites. Among the 32 men who started the race, the Americans were the clear favorites. Thomas Hicks, a British-born American living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was a seasoned and respected marathon runner, having finished second in the Boston Marathon that same year. He was considered a top contender for the gold. Fred Laws, a bricklayer from New York City. He was another accomplished runner from the East Coast, known for his grit. Sam Meller, Arthur Newton, and Frank Pierce, a trio of other notable American athletes, all of whom had experience in long-distance running and were expected to perform well. The international contingent. The few international runners who made the trip were a colorful and, in retrospect, tragically unprepared group. Felix Andarin Carvajal. The story of this Cuban postman is a legend in itself. Carvajal was a charismatic and talented runner who had decided to represent Cuba in the Olympics. He raised money for his journey by putting on running exhibitions in Havana. He made it as far as New Orleans, where, according to the story, he promptly lost all of his travel money in an impromptu dice game. Undeterred, he was forced to walk and hitchhike the rest of the way to St. Louis. He arrived just before the race, gaunt and exhausted. He stood at the starting line wearing his everyday street clothes, a long-sleeved shirt, long dark trousers, a beret, and a pair of heavy walking boots. His predicament was so comical that another athlete took pity on him and, finding a pair of shears, roughly cut his trouser legs off at the knee to give him some semblance of running attire. He had not eaten in nearly 48 hours. Len Tauniane and Jan Mashiani. These two men were the first black Africans to ever compete in the modern Olympic Games. They were members of the Swana tribe from South Africa and were not in St. Louis as athletes. They were actually part of the Boer War exhibit at the World's Fair, where they had likely been brought to be part of the human zoo spectacle. They were known to have been dispatch runners during the recent war, and they were entered into the marathon at the last minute, almost as a curiosity. Neither man had any formal training for a race of this distance. Most remarkably, Len Tauniane ran the entire race barefoot. The everyman William Garcia, a runner from San Francisco, California. Not a favorite, but a determined athlete who had traveled a long way to compete. His story would become one of the most harrowing of the day. This motley crew of serious athletes, enthusiastic amateurs, and curious participants stood together under the blazing afternoon sun on August 30th, 1904. The temperature was already soaring above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 Celsius, and the humidity was stifling. They were about to run a race over a brutal hilly course on unpaved country roads. They were about to be subjected to a misguided experiment in dehydration. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a living nightmare, a race through hell. The race began around 3:00 p.m., the hottest part of the day. The course itself was a brutal challenge, a series of 7 steep hills that the runners would have to climb and descend on dusty, uneven country roads. But the real enemy wasn't the hills, it was the dust. The race was not run on closed roads. The runners were accompanied by a caravan of officials, doctors, observers, and press, all riding in the new invention that was all the rage at the World's Fair, the automobile. These early 20th century cars kicked up a colossal, choking cloud of dust from the unpaved roads. The runners were forced to run directly through this thick, pulverized cloud of Missouri earth for the entire 25 miles. The first major casualty of the race was the Californian William Garcia. After about 9 miles, Garcia collapsed on the side of the road. He was found lying there by race officials, suffering from a severe stomach hemorrhage. The inches of thick dust he had inhaled had coated his esophagus and stomach lining, tearing it and causing massive internal bleeding. He was discovered just in time. If he'd been found an hour later, doctors said, He would have certainly bled to death. He was hospitalized for days and was lucky to survive. One runner down. Meanwhile, the indomitable Cuban postman Felix Carvajal was having the adventure of his life. Despite his absurd attire and his lack of food, he was a naturally gifted runner and was trotting along with the lead pack. He was cheerful and gregarious, frequently stopping to chat with spectators along the route and practice his broken English. At one point, feeling a bit peckish after his 2-day fast, he saw an apple orchard by the side of the road. He happily detoured into the orchard and began grabbing apples from the trees and eating them as he ran. Unfortunately, the apples he chose were rotten. He was soon overcome with violent stomach cramps. In incredible pain, Carvajal was forced to pull over to the side of the road, where he lay down and took a long nap to recover. The barefoot South African, Len Tauniane, was also proving to be a surprisingly strong runner, easily keeping pace with the leaders. He was on track for a potential top 3 finish. However, his race was also diverted by an unforeseen obstacle. At one point on the rural course, he was chased by a pack of aggressive stray dogs that forced him to run nearly a mile off course into a cornfield to escape. He lost a huge amount of time and positions before he could find his way back to the road. As the race wore on under the punishing conditions, the runners began to drop like flies from exhaustion and dehydration. But one man, Fred Laws, seemed to be holding up remarkably well. He entered the Olympic Stadium well ahead of everyone else, looking relatively fresh. The crowd of 10,000 people roared as he crossed the finish line. He was hailed as the winner, presented with a victory wreath, and was just about to be awarded the gold medal by Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of President Teddy Roosevelt, who was in attendance. But just as the ceremony was about to begin, an eyewitness came forward. The truth came out. Fred Laws was a cheat. He had dropped out of the race after 9 miles, suffering from cramps. He had then been picked up by his manager in a car and had ridden for the next 11 miles. The car then conveniently broke down. So, Laws simply got out and jogged the last few miles back to the stadium, waving to the cheering crowds who assumed he was the leader. When confronted, Laws immediately admitted his guilt but claimed it was all just a joke. The officials were not amused. He was promptly disqualified and banned for life from the sport, a ban that was later lifted, and he would go on to win the Boston Marathon legitimately the following year. With the cheater exposed, the attention turned back to the course where the real leader was now approaching. It was Thomas Hicks, the man who had been the favorite from the start. But the Thomas Hicks who was now shuffling towards the stadium was not the same man who had started the race. He was in a state of near total collapse. By the 15-mile mark, Hicks had been begging his 2 trainers, who were following him in a car, for a drink of water. Adhering to the no water rule, they refused. Instead, they just sponged his mouth out with warm distilled water. By the 18-mile mark, Hicks was fading completely. But his trainers, who included one of the race organizers, Charles Lucas, refused to let him quit. They decided to give him a pick-me-up. They gave him a dose of strychnine sulfate mixed with raw egg white. Strychnine is a powerful alkaloid and a neural stimulant. In tiny, medically controlled doses, it was used as a performance enhancer at the time. In slightly larger doses, it is a violent poison, a common ingredient in rat poison that causes horrific muscle convulsions. The dose of strychnine revived Hicks temporarily, and he began to run again. But a few miles later, he was collapsing once more. So his trainers gave him a second dose of strychnine, this time accompanied by a large swig of French brandy. This toxic cocktail of poison, raw egg, and alcohol turned Hicks into a human puppet. He was no longer running, he was shuffling. His skin was pale, his eyes were vacant, and he was hallucinating, believing the finish line was still 20 miles away. For the final 2 miles, he could barely lift his legs. His trainers practically carried him, supporting him on either side as his feet made a shuffling motion. They half-dragged, half-carried him up the final hill and into the stadium. He was declared the official winner of the Olympic marathon with a time of 3 hours and 28 minutes. He had lost 10 pounds during the race and had to be immediately treated by a team of 4 doctors. He was so ill, he couldn't even receive his medal until the next day. He later said of the experience, "The great big event of my life had been a nightmare. I would have been better off if I had died during the race." A legacy of insanity. The final standings of the 1904 Olympic Marathon read like a fever dream. In first place was Thomas Hicks, the man who was actively poisoned by his own support team and had to be carried across the finish line. In second place was a French immigrant to the United States named Albert Corey. In third place was Arthur Newton, who arrived 30 minutes after Hicks and immediately complained that the result was unfair, as he was the only one who had run the entire race without any support or assistance. In a remarkable fourth place was the Cuban postman Felix Carvajal, who, despite his absurd clothing, his 48-hour fast, his detour for rotten apples, and his roadside nap, still managed to finish as one of the top runners. And in a respectable ninth place was the barefoot South African Len Tonyane, despite being chased a mile off course by wild dogs. Of the 32 athletes who had started the race in the brutal afternoon heat, only 14 managed to complete the course. This dismal 44% finish rate remains by far the lowest in the history of the Olympic marathon. The official results don't even begin to tell the full story of the carnage. One man, William Garcia, had nearly bled to death from inhaling dust. The man who crossed the line first was a fraud. The man who was declared the winner had been systematically doped with rat poison and was nearly killed by his own handlers. It was by any measure a complete and utter disaster. Yet in a strange and ironic way, the 1904 marathon, in all its horrifying incompetence, had a profound and positive impact on the future of long-distance running. The race was so catastrophic, the suffering of the runners so extreme and so obviously caused by the conditions, that it served as a brutal and undeniable refutation of the dangerous theories that had governed it. The idea of purposeful dehydration was exposed as the life-threatening quackery that it was. The horrifying state of Thomas Hicks was a clear demonstration of what happens when you deny athletes water in extreme conditions. The aftermath of the St. Louis Marathon became a powerful argument for providing regular hydration and proper medical support to athletes. It was the beginning of the end for the old unscientific, gentlemanly ideas of amateur endurance and the start of the era of modern sports science. The rules were changed. Future marathons would include multiple water stations, and the idea of running such an event in the blistering heat of the afternoon was abandoned. The 1904 Olympic Marathon was not a test of athletic ability, it was a test of pure survival, a contest to see who could endure the most suffering against a backdrop of scorching heat, choking dust, and mind-boggling official incompetence. It stands as a bizarre and cautionary tale from a time when the Olympic Games were a strange and chaotic mix of genuine athleticism, deeply misguided science, and circus-like spectacle. It was a race that produced no heroes in the traditional sense, only a handful of incredibly tough and incredibly lucky survivors, and its strange, dark legacy is a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest obstacle an athlete can face is not the distance of the race, but the breathtaking madness of the people in charge.